didn't rain. So, but that's all right. Got it done. All right. We are in Acts chapter 17 this morning. We just started the chapter last week, looking at Paul and Silas in Thessalonica. So they are here just for a short period of time, really, before they move on. But Paul went into the synagogue. He had preached to them. He had reasoned with them about the truth, and some were persuaded. And you have a great amount of some of them, or so, be devout Greeks, some of the Jews, and mainly Gentiles, from what we see here, that joined Paul and Silas and were baptized. But then, of course, you have the Jews that were upset. So they took evil men from the marketplace, which is, I think, the verse 5 is where we got to. It says, but the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace, and gathering a mob, set all the city in uproar and attacked the house of Jason and sought to bring them out to the people. And so here we have of these evil men. Now, these evil men, this word used here, means basically idlers, vulgar, immoral people. So basically, it's you have lazy people that have nothing better to do besides cause trouble. And we see that today. There are people that are just waiting for something to, in their minds, have fun. And this, mob mentality, that's what they were doing. And so they found these men in the marketplace. They had a purpose. The Jews had a purpose. They knew what they were doing. They knew if they got this mob that it would cause issues. And so they did. And they went to Jason's home. Now, we know that Paul was staying in Jason's home, but we also can probably determine that this is where they were worshiping, because Jason, more than likely, as we're going to see later, probably was one of those prominent men of the city, and I think he was fairly wealthy, because of what we see happening later with Paul and Silas, and so he probably had the room, the space, the ability to house the church there in his home, and so he's a target because of this. And so they go to Jason's home trying to find Paul, but they don't find him. And so then verse 6, it says, but when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, these who have turned the world upside down have come here too. And so since they didn't find Paul, they grabbed Jason and drug him out to the rulers of the city. Now, that phrase, rulers of the city, if you look at the Greek, it's polytarch is the word used here. And I think we've mentioned this before when it was used in Crete, or in Cyprus, not Crete. When they were in Cyprus, the word was used there also. And Kaufman had this interesting take on history on this. The Greek word, which is what I just mentioned, is not found anywhere else in classical Greek literature. So this word is not used by like Aristotle. It wasn't used by Plato, things like those Greek writers that wrote during that time. And so when you think about Greek and these men that do the definitions for what Greek is, they look at how the word is used in the Bible, but they also will look at how it's used by other writers during that time. So Plato, Aristotle, things like that. And this word was never used by any other Greek culture or Greek writer at that time. So when critics of the Bible came and saw this word, they're like, well, Luke just made it up. There is no place in history we've seen this word, so therefore he's making this up, therefore the Bible is not true. Okay, that's what the critics try to do. But what happened was there was an excavation of one of the arches that led to the ancient city, had an exposed and an old inscription which uses the very word, Polycarp, in reference to the rulers of the city. So when they started to do excavations, they find this word on some of the stones and some of the archways and some of the things that was written during that time, that was made during that time. Therefore, what does it do? Proves Luke was using the right word. It proves that Luke knew what he was talking about. It proves that Luke was not a false writer and that he was inspired. And so I'm not going to read all that, but that's what it states there by Kaufman. And so it's interesting, just, it's a kind of a side note, but over and over again, the Bible is proving it's true. Luke is proving he's inspired and that he is using the right terms that fit for that time. And so he's proving the accuracy of the Bible. And so here they drag Jason to these rulers, and they want Jason to be punished for what he is doing here. And so I think there's an interesting phrase at the end of verse 6 is, those who have turned the world upside down have come here too. That's a really powerful statement if you think about it. They turned the world upside down. How is it that they turned the world upside down? When you think of that, what do you think? Huh? Yeah, they changed the beliefs. Customs, everything. Yeah, exactly. They're changing everything from what, you think about it from the Greek perspective, coming into a city of idolatry. What they're used to, what is normal for them, is idol worship. It is polytheism. It is, these very immoral things. There was a lot of very immoral things that was going on with these temple worship, especially in the temple of Diana, which we talked about last time. We talked about Diana in the book of Revelation class in Ephesus. And so that the things that was going on, it was normal for the society then. It was normal for idol worship. It was normal for the temples. It was normal for people to see. And so then you have Paul and Silas coming in, and they're showing them that that is immoral. They're showing them that their normal is not normal, that it's wrong. And so it's going to upset people, right? Nobody likes to be put in an uncomfortable situation. In a way, Paul and Silas are showing them what is sin. They never knew what it was sin. They thought it was normal. And so then you look at the Jews. The Jews, for years, have followed the Old Testament. Now they've come in and they've changed their beliefs. They've shown them that the Messiah has come, that God has a new covenant for them, and that they need to change their life, really. That's a big change for a Jew to go from Judaism to Christianity. There's a lot of changes there. And so it is turning their world upside down. And so it's going to, irritate Jews. It's going to probably irritate Gentiles. We're really seeing the Jews more upset than we are the Gentiles, which is just interesting in itself. But when you think about that, think about the world today. What are we doing to turn the world upside down? Because you think about the normal. What is normal for people? Well, there's a lot of things that's just normal for people. They don't see it as sin. They don't see some of the things that they're doing as sin. We in a sense need to be that abnormal person. Not weird and awkward, but abnormal to what society says is normal. And ways we do that, right, is through our example. The biggest way is through our example. Of course, you're going to have discussions with people You may bring things up, but really it's more on your example. People see, hey, that person's not living the normal that everybody else is. There's something different there. And so I think that's something to think about. Some people will respect that. They may not agree with you. They may not like that you don't do what they do, but they will respect that. And some people will not. Somebody read 1 Peter 4 and verse 4.
Wherein they think it strange that ye run not with them to the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you.
Okay, so some will get to the point where they speak evil of you because of you're not running the same right. You're not running the same normal as them. Some people, when they're put in that situation where they're seeing that their life is probably not normal, it's not right, they get angry. And they may not like you for it. But, that's really the biggest thing is our example in how we can change things in our community. By having a presence, by being an example. And so it's important. I think it's just a powerful statement to read. They turned the world upside down. They were changing what was normal and making the world, their communities, better. And so then that brings us to verse 7. It says, Jason had harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus. And so they're trying to really pin treason upon them. What is treason?
Being a traitor.
Yeah, being a traitor. A traitor of what? The government. So Rome at that time. So they're trying to, which, remember, this is Jews. They're trying to pin Christians, Paul and Silas here, as traitors of Rome. Very interesting, because they're Jews. And so, somebody read Acts 18 and verse 2.
And found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them.
All right, so Claudius is the emperor at this time, or the Caesar. And it said he came from Italy. Well, Italy is Rome. And so they were pushed out of Rome because of Claudius. Claudius hated Jews. And he forced them out of their city. So that's just another chapter later. So Claudius is emperor now. You have Jews being hated by Claudius, yet these Jews are saying, well, he's a traitor. They're traitors. We're not. Somebody read John 19 and verse 15.
But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar.
So when Christ was being crucified, they say that Caesar's their king. And so they're looking for that Messiah, but they want to say Caesar is their Caesar or their king, not Christ. Which we know when we're talking about kingdom, this is spiritual kingdom, and they don't understand that. We're going to talk about that. But it's just interesting. You have Jews here who are trying to pin some of the same things that they believe on Paul and Silas so that they can be just, punished. The same thing will happen to Jesus. Those Jews do not want Caesar as their king. They want Israel to be free. They want Israel to be under their own rule again. They want the Messiah to come and free them from Rome. We see that with other passages. But when it comes down to it, and they're angry, they're going to side with Rome so that they can get what they want. And that's exactly what's going on here. The Jews hate Paul and Silas, and they want them to be punished. And so they're trying to pin treason upon them. Now, treason is a serious charge in Rome, in the Roman Empire, and it brings about severe consequences. So they knew they could get in very big trouble for this.
That they actually would think that they could force the issue and that God would give them what they wanted. They wanted a king on earth. You think they thought that if they got rid of Jesus, that God would give them a king on earth finally?
I think that they were looking for the wrong type of person. So when Jesus came, he was not the one that they wanted.
Yeah, I know that.
And so that was their image. Their image was that, it was a physical, kind of like your Saul and David situation. So they had to put out of their mind that Christ really was God and that he was the Son of God, and that's what they tried to do. So I think, yes, in a way, they not really thought God would send them the person they wanted. It was more of they just didn't want to believe that Christ was really the one, the Messiah, and that they were still hoping that their ruler would come later. It doesn't make sense, but a person, really, anybody can tell themselves something 100 times, and after a while they're going to believe it, right?
I suppose that when you got all of this here, and your leaders have seen it and seen it and seen it, and they've taught it and taught it, eventually you've got to admit something's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. But they didn't want to.
No.
And that's stubbornness, and that's a hardened heart.
Yeah,
It's just like,
they didn't ever want to be happy.
Yeah.
Even if they would have got someone else that wouldn't have satisfied them.
yeah. Just like Pharaoh. Pharaoh, how many times, it took 10 times for him to say, fine, you just go. Because he had all that evidence that God was there, God was true, and he didn't want to believe it. And so it's the same thing, and people do that today. You can show them all the evidence in the world, but they're still going to believe what they want to believe if they don't have the right heart.
Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to see a difference between these Jews that were at Thessalonica and the Jews that are at Berea here in a little bit, because they had an open heart. They had a desire to want to know the truth. All these before really didn't, and Thessalonica especially. And so they're trying to pin treason upon him, but also if you notice, they're really taking out of context what Paul and Silas are teaching. They're trying to teach that, or they're trying to say that Paul and Silas are talking about this physical kingdom that they are in, that Christ is their king of this kingdom, and we're going to see that that's going to confuse really the Romans also, and those that are in idols, because they didn't understand the spiritual versus the physical here. And they didn't really either. Jews didn't either. But notice how this was phrased by Luke. He says there is another king, Jesus. I think this is important because he didn't say that there would be a king. He said that there is another. What did Paul believe about Christ and as a king? One is in future, one is in present. Paul said, presently, he is king in this kingdom. That's what he was teaching. Now, this is not Paul speaking here. This is what they're saying, what Paul was saying. But they're just relaying what Paul was preaching, that he is king, that he is in his kingdom. So Paul, he is showing us that we are living in that kingdom, that Christ is sitting upon his throne. That's Acts chapter 2. The end of about verse 30 through 36. Christ is upon his throne. And so this is not a future thing. Paul knew at that point that he was in the kingdom and that Christ was reigning. And that's still the case today. And so, here, when he's saying presently, I am in this kingdom, presently Christ is king, they're taking that as, there's some kingdom that's going to try to take over Rome right now. And there's this king that's over that, which is Christ. And they're taking it out of context. And so Kaufman had an interesting quote or thing to think about with this. He says, at a particular point in history, the Gentile representatives of Caesar were unusually sensitive to such charges. So what he's saying is, they're very sensitive to someone saying there's another king. They're very sensitive to the fact that they're talking about that. And so the incident illustrates why the epistles of Paul as well as Acts have relatively little to say about the kingdom of God. It is because these ideas of the kingdom, familiar and precious to believing Jews, were subject to misunderstanding by Romans. And so if you notice, as we go through the book of Acts, we don't see a lot about Christ as king. We do in Acts chapter 2 when he was in Jerusalem. Peter was in Jerusalem preaching. We don't see that a lot later. But we do see it in Paul's letters, though. When he is writing to Christians, he mentions Christ. You talk about Colossians chapter 1. He spends a lot of the book of the first chapter of Colossians talking about Christ as preeminence, as the King of Kings. And so we don't see that a lot here through the book of Acts, but we do see that a lot in his letters. And so it's cost me an interesting thought on that of why we don't. Maybe this is one of the examples, because when you start to mention that king to people that don't understand who Christ is, they're going to take that out of context. And so,
is there any sort of Christianity being taught in Israel right now?
yeah, I think there's a church. I think there's a church in Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's not Jewish.
That's not Jewish. I'm not 100% sure on how much, but I know there is in Israel, because there's a lot of groups that go to the Middle East or to those areas. And
Israel itself isn't all that dangerous. It's just everything around.
well, anymore, I don't know anymore.
Just that bad.
I guess you would know. Was there a congregation in Israel? I thought there was, because there's a lot of groups that I know, like B.J. Clark, he takes a group to Israel. But I know they also do a lot of studies on their own too, but they try to go to different congregations when they're traveling. So I think there is, but I'm not 100% sure. But it's something interesting, and well, not interesting, but as we're going to talk about, as we talk about Revelation, the book of Revelation was written to the 7 churches of Asia. There is not one church in those cities anymore. None of them. Ephesus, Pergamos, Sardis, all of them, all those cities. There is no church. Matter of fact, if you try to go to some of these cities in these areas, it is pretty dangerous. So, did you guys go to any of those areas over there?
We went to Rome. A lot of that area was kind of blocked off, or allowed to get close to certain areas.
Yeah.
We went to Greece.
To Greece.
Yeah, and Rome.
I know BJ. They take a group to like Ephesus and to Pergamos and areas like that. But they talk about when you get off the bus, there's guys with machine guns lining, protecting them. So it's pretty dangerous in some of those areas anymore. But the church is not there; it's not existent. And so, yeah, and I think that's a lot of the case with really most of these places they're talking about now. So, sad. All right, so we're looking at verse 7. And so the fact of the church and of the kingdom here, look at verse 8. It says, "And they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go." And so Jason was let go, and Paul departed from there. And so verse 8, they troubled the crowd, but we don't hear of anything else. We don't hear of any persecution from this. We just know that there's a mob that is angry. But verse 9, it says, when they had taken security from Jason. The word security means a bond. It means like a sufficient amount. And so it's really kind of interesting, the fact that they're taking, basically Jason had to give up security to say that they're not going to trouble the city anymore. So if it was really a bond, like we would think today, someone being released from prison that pays a bond, Jason was probably well off enough to be able to do that. And so he pays a bond in a sense to be released, to basically give assurance that they would not be a disturbance anymore. Well, the church continues to grow. Paul writes to them, 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians, and they have done a great amount of work in this area and through Macedonia. So it didn't stop the church from growing. But I think what they did was they got rid of Paul. They sent Paul away. And I think Paul was the one that they were angry with. And when they sent Paul away, it probably calmed down because of the Jews. And really, because what was going on here is the Jews are the ones that are causing the problem. It's the hatred for him. And so under these difficult situations, they were sent away. So I'm going to read 1 Thessalonians 2, 13 through 18. It's raining. Sorry, I can see it. 1 Thessalonians 2, 13 through 18.
For this cause also thank we God without ceasing, because when ye received the word of God, which ye heard of us, ye received it not as the word of men, but as it is in truth the word of God, which effectually worketh also in you that believe. For ye, brethren, became followers of the churches of God, which in Judea are in Christ Jesus. For ye also have suffered like things of your own countrymen, even as they have of the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus and their own prophets, and have persecuted us, and they please not God, and are contrary to all men, forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles, that they might be saved, to fill up their sins always. For the wrath is come upon them to the uttermost. But we, brethren, being taken from you for a short time in presence, not in heart, endeavor the more abundantly to see your face with great desire. Wherefore we would have come unto you, even I, Paul, once and again, but Satan hindered us.
All right, so Paul writing later to them tells them, just gives us a summary of some of the things that happened to him, because we're now done with Thessalonica. Paul is moving on. And Paul gives just a brief statement about what had happened to him. They were preventing them from teaching to the Gentiles. He says, I desire to come back to you, but why he couldn't was Satan hindered him. So by the Jews chasing him everywhere he went, he looked at that as Satan trying to stop him, and it was. They were doing the will of Satan and trying to prevent the gospel from spreading. And so, Paul desired to go back. We kind of believe, you look at what he talked about, how he spent 3 Sabbaths with them. So roughly this was about 3 weeks, but some think that could have been longer. Paul was there, but he wasn't there very long, and then he had to move on. And so some other information before we move on to Berea. We're in 1 Thessalonians 2. So I'm going to read verse 9 now.
For you remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you. We preached unto you the gospel of God.
All right, so while Paul was in Thessalonica, he also worked to support himself, so he was not a burden upon them. He uses that phrase in other places, and it's a reference to the fact that he was a tent maker. And so while he was there in Thessalonica, not only was he preaching the opportunities that he had and teaching and working in the synagogue, but he was also trying to support himself while there. But they become a great support for Paul later on in a lot of ways in his endeavors in this area. And so, but now we see Paul taken away. Now we get to verse 10. Any questions or anything before we move on? All right, someone will read verse 10 through 15 now. Do you guys have my pastor notes on this? All right, so the brethren immediately, so after they were let go, Jason was let go, they immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And so the Jews are still looking for Paul. They want him stopped, and so they sent him away by night. It says when they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. Here again, Paul goes to a new area. What's he do? He goes to the synagogue, right? Somebody read Romans 1 verse 16.
For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek.
All right, so the Jew first. Paul understood that he was to take the gospel to the Jews. His purpose was, his mission was to take it to the Gentiles, but he still had that place in his heart for the Jews, his brethren. I think it's Romans chapter 9. And his desire for them to hear the truth. And so every place he went, he always would go to the synagogue. And so usually in every place that Paul went, as he went into the synagogue, he would reason with them, and there would not be much result from that. Good, it'd be bad. But what happens here in Berea, it's different. He's talking about the Jews. He's talking about those that he had just went in to talk to. These were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica, and they received the word with all readiness and searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. And so the King James uses noble, so we'll always, I always say that, the noble Bereans. But here it says they were fair-minded. Fair-minded means noble, but it also has a meaning of being excellent, honorable. So they were excellent in mind. The word fair there is what we're looking at. But fair-minded, excellent in mind, they're more honorable in mind. How were they this way? I mean, what shows us that? Well, they were ready to hear and receive the word. The word readiness means zeal, spirit, eagerness. They had a desire to hear what Paul had to say. They had a desire to hear this message and eagerly wanted to know more. And that eagerness brought them to search the scriptures and to find the truth. And so not only did they do this once, but they did this daily. So Paul was here in the synagogue for a period of time. He was for 3 Sabbaths in Thessalonica trying to reason with them. But their hearts were different here. Their hearts had the right soil. Somebody read Luke 8 and verse 15.
But the ones that fell on good ground are those who, having heard the word of noble and good heart, keep it, bear fruit, and with patience.
All right. Yeah, so when you're talking about the soils in Luke chapter 8, you have the good soil, and that's their hearts. And so this is always a perfect example of Luke 8 and verse 15 of the good soil. It's one that has a readiness, one that has a desire to want to know the truth and continues to work to find the truth. And so they didn't take Paul's word for it. And I like that. I like looking at that because Paul's an inspired man. He is able to perform miracles. The Holy Spirit is working through him. Yet these people still did not take his word for it. They went and looked for themselves. And that seemed really, when you think about salvation, a person needs to understand what they're doing. If they need to understand what they believe. That's important to me. If I've had, Cassie has come to me and talked to me about baptism. She doesn't, I want to make sure she completely understands what she's doing because it's important. That's what these people were doing here. They didn't just take somebody's word for it. They didn't take what they had heard many times and just went for it. They made sure that they understood Christ is the Messiah, that this is God's plan, and that this is what they need to do. And that's noble. It's excellent.
Where did the urgency come in? Like, at what point do you realize, you're pricked to the heart and you're urgent about it?
The urgency, I think, comes in when you realize sin you know,
in your life.
yeah, it's in your life.
That makes sense.
Because a person, you know, we were talking about normal. You know, people look at the things that are around them as normal. They don't see some of the things that they may be doing in this world that are sinful. But once they realize it's sinful and God's not pleased with that, and what the consequences could be for that sin, there's an urgency. I want to get rid of that in my life. And that's salvation. You know, that was what Acts chapter 2, verse 37 was. They were pricked in their hearts when they realized that they had killed the Messiah, that they needed to be righteous with God, and they wanted to fix it. And so, you know, I think that's the same for, you know, those that are young people that are growing up. Once they reach that point where they realize that they have sin in their life, they're ready. And so here they wanted to find the truth. They wanted to make sure what they understood what they were doing, and they did. And so the result of that is the next verse, verse 12. It says, therefore many of them believed, and also not a few of the Greeks, prominent women as well as men. And so many of them believed. It's different. And then verse 4 says some of them were persuaded. Here we have a great amount of them were persuaded to convert to Christianity. And of course, again, the word believe there, apart for the whole, it's a giving us the showing us that this is salvation. It's using the one word to describe the plan of salvation. It's not, but yeah. So there were several that believed. Not only that, we have Gentiles believing and prominent women. This has happened in several places, hasn't it? We don't see prominent men. We see prominent women that are being converted, which I think that gives meaning to, you know, 1 Peter chapter. Is it 1 Peter chapter 5, where Paul talks about the wife who has a husband that doesn't believe, what she can do. Here we have prominent women do not have husbands that are believing, but yet through their example and through their living, they can persuade their spouse. And so I think that's, you know, why we see that written later. So we're out of time. Any questions or comments on anything here? All right. Thank you guys for your time this morning.